who is the chair of the policy committee, since this is our policy workshop.
Good evening, everyone. So this is actually the inaugural meeting of a new process that we're going to undergo concerning policies at Hartford Public Schools. As chair of the policy committee and with the board liaison, Dr. Vasquez Matos, we have implemented a new system of really reviewing, gathering community input, and then bringing policy for first and second read. So this evening is actually going to be a first read of 3 policies, one on school governance councils, one on conduct and discipline, and then we're going to have a discussion on policies to repeal. During this process, Dr. Vasquez Matos will introduce the policies, we'll have public comment from any of you all, and then we'll have discussion as a board and as central office staff. So I'm going to read the public comment introduction for this inaugural policy workshop meeting. As a board, in collaboration with the superintendent and district leadership, we are committed to cultivating a culture of excellence at all levels of Hartford Public Schools. We thank you for taking the time to attend tonight's policy workshop meeting. We appreciate you coming out to learn more about Hartford Public Schools and for sharing your thoughts and concerns. We believe it is important to have parent and community input, and we have established a protocol for public comment following the introduction for each policy, where 15 minutes will be allotted. In order to ensure all are heard, you will have 2 minutes to speak, and at the 1 minute mark, Ms. Santiago will ring the bell, letting you know that you have 1 minute left. At the second bell, please wrap up your comments. Please note there will be public comment following the introduction for each policy on the agenda, and we ask that you limit your comments to the policy being discussed. You can sign up to speak for each policy. After each policy has been reviewed and discussed, the board will decide to take a vote and move for second reading or adoption, or reach consensus to send it back to the policy committee. Now, Mr. Julio Flores will read this in Español.
Nosotros, la Junta de Educación, en colaboración con la superintendente y el personal de distrito, estamos comprometidos a cultivar una cultura de excelencia en todos los niveles de las escuelas públicas de Hartford. Les agradecemos que se haya tomado el tiempo para asistir a la reunión de la Junta esta noche. Les agradecemos su participación y su deseo de aprender más sobre las escuelas públicas de Hartford, y también por compartir sus pensamientos y preocupaciones. Creemos que es importante contar con la opinión de los padres y la comunidad, y hemos establecido un protocolo para comentarios del público después de la introducción de cada política, donde se asignarán 15 minutos. Para asegurarse de que todos sean escuchados, tendrá 2 minutos para hablar. En la marca de 1 minuto, la señora Santiago sonará el timbre, dejándole saber que le queda 1 minuto. Al segundo sonido, por favor, termine sus comentarios. Tenga en cuenta que habrá comentarios públicos después de la introducción de cada política en la agenda, y le solicitamos que limite sus comentarios a la política que se está discutiendo. Puede inscribirse para hablar de cada política. Después de que cada política haya sido revisada y discutida, la Junta decidirá votar y pasar a la segunda lectura y adopción, o llegar a un consenso para enviarla al Comité de Políticas. Si alguna persona necesita traducción en español, por favor, levante la mano. Tenemos una persona para ayudarle con eso.
Thank you so much, Mr. Flores. And because this is a policy committee workshop pilot, I'm going to offer anyone who wants to add their name to the public speaking list. Right now we have 1 person. So if anyone would like to add their name to the public speaking list, please do see Christina Santiago. The first policy that we're going to be looking at is quite popular: school governance councils, and Dr. Vasquez Matos will give us an overview of the policy.
So before turning it over to Dr. Vasquez Matos, I just want to make a connection to the priorities in the district model of excellence, and specifically the new process and protocol is in alignment with the operational effectiveness priority around making sure that our resources, our initiatives, and our operations, hence, this protocol, minimize redundancies and maximize the efficiencies to support excellent teaching and learning. And so we wanted to just frame the connection to that. Dr. Vasquez Matos.
Thank you, Dr. Torres Rodriguez. First of all, I want to thank the policy committee, especially our board members who are on the committee, for the hard work in the last couple of months of really putting this new way of work around policy committee and really putting some strong policies forward to support our students in our schools. But as it begins, so policies are principles and guidelines adopted by the board in order to support the school system's goals and guide the administrative decisions. Policies convey standards and set parameters for compliance with legal requirements. They are broad enough to indicate a line of action to be taken by administration, meeting a number of day-to-day problems, and they need they're narrow enough to give the administration clear guidance. The definition of policy can be expanded to include statutes that come from the state to update our policies, agreements that are signed through bargaining units to guide our work on everyday HR practices, as well as regulations, in particularly to areas that may be sensitive due to the time and the historical context. So allowing these policies to come forward allows us actually to engage in conversations on what is best for our students and what is best for the institution as we move forward. So in looking at the first policy, which is the policy around school governance councils, a lot of conversation has happened around this policy and the way of work. And much input has come from school administration, partners with the school district. Information has come from the Office of Community Engagement, who works closely with SGCs, as well as members who have a historical context, for fellow board members who have a historical context of this of policy. But most importantly, a lot of it actually is aligned with state statute, and making sure that actually we update it to make sure it aligns with what the state has provided to us as guidance, in making sure that we are aligned with what the expectations is of the state. So with that said, I'm going to respectfully ask that Nushet Blackburg, who joins me in the conversation, as well as Carla Cruz and Nancy Williams, who have also been part of the work around this policy, as their day-to-day roles actually interact a lot with this policy as well, to address any questions we may have. I also have with me our legal counsel, Gwen Zatoun, who has been very helpful and is sitting in for Julia Wilde, who can address concerns, questions, or clarifications that may come forward.
Back to you, Karen. Okay, so we have one person signed up as of right now for two? We're growing. So I would like to welcome up for public comment on SGC policy, Andrew Clark.
Good evening. Good evening. How are you? Is the bell starting? So I gather I have 2 minutes. 2 minutes is not nearly enough time to go into my experience with SGCs. This document, the 4 preceding documents in the last 10 years, all the changes that have been made. My concern is mainly on process. And I draw it mainly from my experience both in state government and working on commissions with the state legislature, understanding policy, laws, how they get enacted, public participation in them, stakeholder participation in them, and through my experience with Hartford Public Schools as both member and chair of the Annie Fisher Montessori SGC. And all I can say, first and foremost, given that it appears that I won't have much time to say anything else here, is that the process severely lacks real meaningful dialogue on the ground level. I mean, this is a popular document with SGCs, but I would wonder how many are even know this is happening. I mean, I think most of the people in here work for the district, aren't representing SGCs, and it's not for the sake that they don't want to participate. That means a minute. It's just they're not meaningfully engaged in this. And I remember being at a board meeting where, Mr. Flores, you talked about wanting to have people meaningfully engaged, your experience with SGCs. And I know members here do, but I just have to tell you, I feel like I'm in the Supreme Court here talking to you guys. I've been in rooms with the governor, with corrections commissioners and the like, and it's a heck of a lot less formal than this. And we have people representing constituencies, and I don't want you to take this personally because you shouldn't. None of this is personal. It's about process. And like people that really care. I mean, there are so many people that have put their lives on hold to be a part of this, and then they come up against things like this that are fundamentally changing what they're doing, and they haven't been meaningfully engaged in it. And they can be. It's pretty simple. Take away the microphones, get a room, tell what's the problem we're trying to solve here, and ask, what is your experience? Do it over a few work sessions and whatnot. 2 minutes with, I don't even know if there's question and answer with this, but it's just not a process that really engages the very people that you're trying to bring into shared governance here. And shared governance means shared governance. And that's the bottom line. That's the spirit of this. If you have shared governance, it's got to be with the people that are sharing that governance, not top down. And that's what I'd plead to you.
Thank you for your public comment. So as part of the process, we're going to talk amongst ourselves, like as a board, to really figure out like what the next step should be concerning each policy. So I really do appreciate your comments, and I'm able to spend a little more time on you tonight because we only have 2 folks who are talking here this evening. So thank you.
Okay.
I'd like to call up Elena. Tell me again. Zuhruf, please.
My name is Elena Zuhruf. I'm a 15-year resident of Hartford, and I vote in Hartford. I was the parent liaison for a year at Annie Fisher Montessori School. My husband served on the PTO for, 2 or 3 years. He also served on the SGC. And my experience was through him that he was very frustrated with the whole process. At Annie Fisher, they were supposed to vote on the budget of the school, and whatever small little part that they had, they simply couldn't exercise their that one little small part of overseeing the budget because the budget didn't come through in time, and they weren't notified in time, and so what tiny little part that they were charged to do, they could not. And I understand that Hartford is cash-strapped, but I think we all know that the communication, and I hate that word, it feels like things are being done behind our back, and every week we're constantly taken by surprise. And yes, okay, we should keep up with what the Board of Ed is doing and what the district is doing, but the Board of Ed is not contacting us. They're not contacting, and I'm also a parent at Renzulli as well, and they're not contacting our SGC. They're not contacting at Annie Fisher or at Renzulli. And so I think you're creating a lot of problems for yourselves because we think that you're being secretive and you're operating behind our backs and you're not letting us know what's going on. And it really creates an atmosphere of distrust, and it makes us want to fight. And I don't think you need that, and I don't think we do either. I think we would like to be in cooperation with you, and so we would like to be notified of what's going on, and we would like our SGCs strengthened and not weakened, and I'm very concerned about this, and I'll listen very closely to what you have to say today, because I think our SGCs are a very important part of working together with parents and getting parents' cooperation rather than their anger. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for your comments. going to do one more just kind of commercial for conduct and discipline policy that we'll be talking about next. If you'd like to sign up to talk about that or the discussion on the policies repeal, please do see Christina. So that concludes public comment for our school governance councils. And now we'll open it up for Q&A and discussion amidst board members.
I'll go. Are they going to present anything further to us at this point? Okay. But they're part of the ours. I mean, but now, are we going to highlight the specific changes? We should highlight the specific changes.
Okay, so this is a pilot. We are going to be in dialogue with central office staff and the board members, and Dr. Vasquez Matos will kind of bring us through as best we can, particularly regarding this policy since it's been in existence for so long and it's been subject to so many revisions. We are going to have a discussion amidst central office staff about the history of the SGC policy and any salient changes that have been made and that need to be discussed at this meeting.
Okay, so we're going to kind of do this as a team approach. So on page 1, on paragraph 1, there were some just word changes, which you can see in your documents. You'll see a strike through what was changed and what was added. So basically what was added and changed was consistent with the district model of excellence to make all schools high quality for all students. The Board of Education will authorize the formation of school-based governance councils to advise of the development of its schools. Last sentence on the paragraph, we added that it is the benefit of each school to have a non-voting participation of the school governance council, as you see, from school staff, parents, legal guardians, and community members. And we can give a rationale for that, of why we added the non-voting members to that. If Carla or Nishette want to explain why we added that, because you'll see that kind of in the chart on page 3. We can give the rationale about that.
Can we pause for one moment? Can we at least discuss why do we have school governance councils? Why was this policy even created? I think if we start there, we can probably better understand the passion of the parents, because now it's like, okay, so we can maybe start with why.
Sure, and I can take the first stab at that explanation, and then I think involvement from staff who've been involved in modifying the policy over the years would be very helpful as well. So several years ago, we have a new law in Connecticut that created these school governance councils specifically to address low-performing schools. What Hartford has selected to do in an effort to comply with that mission, that first statement that was just read, is to ensure that all schools have appropriate governance and are represented by parents, community members, staff members, and to ensure consistency among district schools. So it's not only schools that fall below certain levels on certain state assessments and under the state improvement plans, but that all schools are consistently using these councils to provide guidance to principals and other school leaders on budgetary issues, on school operations, on hiring of principals in schools, and to be able to provide that input. So that's where it comes from. It is based in state statute. The statute itself is quite prescriptive. It includes specifically who must be on these school governance councils, how they are elected, who is involved in that election process, and outlines a number of responsibilities, which I named a few of, but the statute's quite extensive as to the responsibilities of the school governance council. So it is based in state statute. Maybe we could have some more information about how this developed over the years and the process for revising the policy.
May I ask you a question?
Of course.
Over the years, there's been some confusion over terms. And they're called, I know in the statute, it's called the School Governance Council. And the question that comes up all the time is, are we truly talking about governance, or are we talking about an advisory role? So how do you see that?
Well, the statute
calls it School Governance Council very specifically. The role of the Governance Council, though, is, and the different roles have different voting obligations and different kind of supervisory roles. So each role is different, but in general, the role of the School Governance Council is to provide input and perspective to the administration. And I could go through the specific roles for each of those, but essentially the final say in decision-making for the school is left to the administration with the guidance as a general overview. Again, there's different roles of the School Governance Council, but as a general matter, there's a vote that occurs within the School Governance Council, and then the decision is essentially provided to the school principal to make certain decisions. But again, there's many different roles listed in the statute, and then in your policy as well, which as revised mirrors the statute.
So effectively, it's advisory, the administration can decide otherwise.
Correct in many ways.
Thank you.
Wondering if anyone else has any other contextual background to give before.
I just want it to be, so there were parents who did some lobbying. This is my understanding. I may not be 100% correct. That they were actually trying to mirror the parent trigger law in California. To say a school is not functioning, we're going to reconstitute the school. I think everybody, well, a lot of people may have seen Waiting for Superman. So as a compromise in Connecticut, my understanding was that's how this came about. We're not going to have that parent trigger law in Connecticut, but this was what was settled on. So to me, the word governance, the meaning of that is a little bit different than advisory. So I've gotten a little bit concerned, but I'll hold my questions or comments for more into the presentation. But I'll end it there.
I'm glad that Ms. Brody brought that up, because I was actually going to ask, can you speak a little bit to the legislative intent behind it? I mean, I know you mentioned that it was to address low-performing schools, and so what was the rationale for that? I guess and I don't know. I think that sort of is a little bit
Sure.
about.
And I wish I could address more specifically what the rationale was several years ago, but I'm not specifically up to date on the initial legislation. As moving forward, there have been changes through the years, certainly. One of the most recent changes, and we were going to address this tonight in this policy that is not in your red line currently, and there was a recent change in that parents or guardians who serve on school advisory committees may serve regardless of their role as a public official. So there's continuous discussion about this, meaning that, whether or not you are on the Board of Education and you are a parent in the school. And we have interpreted that to be teachers in the school and other supervisors in the school, that you may participate as a parent. That is your role. And so we can see that there's constant change happening in the legislature and focus on this organization, which is quite important to the schools. One piece that I didn't address, which I think was mentioned by Ms. Brody, was reconstitution of a school. And that vote is different than other votes that happen through the school governance council, right? So that's why I said there are many different roles and many different weights that this vote has. And that vote does go through a very specific process once the school governance council votes to reconstitute a school. And that goes through all sorts of approval, and that has significantly more impact than other votes that then go through the administration.
So the board has an extremely active role in that,
Oh, yes, because then the vote comes to the board through different steps, through the superintendent. There are many other steps that happen, but that role is quite heavy on the school governance council.
So some other major changes throughout the documents is just kind of making sure that we follow kind of the context and the language. So we've added throughout the documents, not just to include parents, but it says parents or guardian throughout the document, which was not there previously. On page 3, you can see more clearly kind of the members and the representation of what will comprise of the school governance council of a school, including alternate members, which is clearly defined in the document. On page 1, to Gwen's point, there is a sentence that we would have to delete based on what we most recently found. And if you see the sentence that says any staff member employed within a school who has children attending the school where they are employed, or any district employee who serves on a supervisory role cannot serve as a parent legal guardian on the council, that entire sentence needs to be deleted. And then we'll start a new sentence saying any staff member, and that will continue in the existing document. Other some major changes is actually the election of date. Previously, it was June 1st, and we moved it to October 1st. And the rationale behind that is based on the feedback we're receiving is, as you know, we are a choice district, so lottery does happen, and after kind of the lottery happens, there may be shifts of parents moving to different schools, so people who are actually elected and during that time period might not actually be at the same school they were voted in when the start of the school happens, which means that it creates an obstacle from decision makings, principal interviews, and so forth. So one of the goals actually in trying to make sure that we have really clear processes and trying to remove the obstacles is actually also is one of the principal selection and kind of trying to attract principals in a timely manner to have them in place for schools, but also having the process done for the acting going into an appointed principal earlier in the school year.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So, because I have a million things to say about this, but I'm trying to understand if we're looking on the web the colored copy, I guess this might be a question for Christina, is the red crossing out, that's obvious, but the light blue, that's what's being added? The proposed, okay.
That's correct.
Okay. So I didn't know how we were going to do this. Are we waiting for you to review the policy? Are we okay.
So in speaking to Board Member Taylor, what she wanted me kind of highlights major changes, and then instead of going to line by line, because it is a lengthy document, just to allow kind of where some of the major changes have happened. The filling of vacancies, we basically aligned to kind of state statute. The attachment that was in the back was deleted because, just to make sure, because we embedded it throughout the document. And just kind of deleted some positions that no longer exist in the district and added actually new offices and positions that are actually now part of the district, like the Office of Outreach and so forth. Anything else that anyone wants to contribute?
And just I need to turn that on. And also just something to really call out is the addition that any certified staff in the building can serve on the SGC. I think that's important to highlight. Yep. So, and then also ensuring that attendance is recorded and tracked for our SGCs in the event there needs to be action taken by the SGC. It's already there, and no one can feel like they're being excluded because attendance has or has not been tracked. And Dr. Matos talked about the change in elections, but again, in a highly transient district, just making sure that October 1st is a great time to do that. And I think those are all of the major changes. Dr. V did address the others.
So this was really helpful in terms of like getting an overview of like the kind of like the historical context of the policy. We're hearing about like state statute, but I also, through this process, any other things that may be impacted by policies, this is a great time for us to have that discussion. So I know that there was a lot of conversation around the guidebook that came out and the revisions that were dated for October 2018. So if anyone could really speak to that and talk to us about how it aligns or maybe any differences where it deviates from the policy, I think that that would be really helpful for people to hear this evening.
So the guidebook that was shared in October included the principal selection guidelines. So terminology can be confusing because we have a guidebook with guidelines inside of it for the principal selection process specifically. And that process has changed, but that was outside of the policy work that the policy committee and the family engagement committee did. That was work that we, alongside revising the current policy, we also revised the guidelines for the principal selection process. So that was a significant change.
So can you specifically speak to like how it deviates from what is currently written in policy and what was then recommended in terms of the guidelines in the guidebook?
Sure. So we actually developed a one-pager for the guidelines, so that way our SGCs would have a quick reference to guide their work and also to guide central office and the administration in our process for selecting principals. What we have added is that, as noted before by Dr. Vasquez-Matos, that we have allowed for alternate members to be voted into the SGCs, and that allows us and the SGCs to move along swiftly if there is a vacancy at the school for a principal position. Sometimes it's hard to get people who can commit the time to do that, and so it allows for alternates who are also serving in that capacity to become voting members of the selection committee process. So we can move that process along, because a lot of times what we've had is we've started the process and it's with calendars and just, as we cultivate candidates and they're coming in from out of town, sometimes it lengthens the process unduly, and so really the effort was to streamline the process, but to make sure that we have the essential input from the SGC as we move along in that process. So what we did is we put together a timeline by which we have to post a vacancy, the outreach to parents and the SGC chair specifically about getting dates on the calendar, and also making sure that we have postings that are, instead of being until filled, it's a 10-day posting, and going off of that, basing the calendar for selection after that. What would that be for our central office screening process? When would that take place, getting those dates on the calendar? And also holding the time for the superintendent once the SGC interviews the final candidates and receives the feedback from the SGC on from their interviews with the candidates that are presented to them for consideration.
I have a few more questions around that, but I'm going to open it up to any of my colleagues here on the board. Or Dr. Torres-Rodriguez, did you have something that you wanted to speak to?
Just, can you also speak to the advisory, for example, advisory board member?
Right.
Just
so,
to highlight.
Yes. So one of the key partners in some of our schools are the advisory boards, and they are usually in a professional field, but there may not be members of the SGC. So we have put into the guidelines that we would also seek their input to be part of the process, so that way we're really getting everyone's thoughts on the candidates as they are presented to the SGC.
Can you also, just one more?
Yeah.
In terms of the training, I know that there's, we talked about a shift in the October timeline, and so we wanted to make sure that there was training on both sides, both ends of the school year.
Yeah, no, that was actually really smart on our part to do that, because what we had done previously is when a principal vacancy became available, we did the training at that time, and we thought it would be fruitful for us to coordinate efforts, and when they host their SGC training in the fall, we should include the principal training, so that way, should a vacancy arise, everyone who's on an SGC has been trained, and also to inform people about what the process looks like. So that way people aren't wondering, oh, I've heard there's a process, but what does that look like? So that way we can talk to them about their role as a school government in regards to the principal selection process, the budget process, the school improvement plan process. So really just hitting the key major areas. And we also plan to host another training in the spring, just in case we have other folks who come on board after the October election. So that way we're hitting everyone. And if there is a vacancy that comes available now, we are hosting trainings for those people who weren't able to be trained in the October training.
I'm like, I guess I'm mediating this. So Mr. Flores and then Ms. Glanville.
I believe one of the items of greatest concern to people is the principal hiring process. Could you explain the changes to that and the rationale behind it?
So previously we had a process where OTM and the Executive Director of Leadership would meet with the SGC, and if there was an acting principal, they had the option of going with process one, which was to vote that acting principal be considered by the superintendent for recommendation to the Board of Ed. Or they could vote to say, no, we would like to open up that process and look at other alternate candidates. It could include also the acting principal, but the idea was to open up the full selection process. And our current guidelines have changed. Right now, if there is an acting principal, with consultation with the SGC, the superintendent can take their feedback from that consultation with an interview, so that way she can make a decision about moving ahead with that acting principal. So really trying to streamline the process, but also get the key feedback from the SGC.
Do you have additional questions, Mr. Flores? Are you good? Okay. Ms. Glanville?
So that actually raised, I have a bunch of questions, probably. One of them is, and I think that this is from Ms. Zatoun, perhaps what is the actual statutory requirement for the principal hiring? And I don't know if I can sort of give my follow-up comments to that. I don't know if you want to answer it first. But I just, on this particular piece around both the acting principal, the way the guideline book is changing, and then also I think with the timeline of elections and training being moved to October, I think both of those issues, I just wanted to, I guess this is a comment, frame, I do think that is a very, very positive change to move the timeline, to move the elections and the training to October. And I'll share, as I have kids who attend one of our very highly transient schools, and I can't, it was an absolute train wreck. This is several years ago, almost 5 years ago. At the time, we had an SGC that was elected in the spring, and literally everyone who was elected to it, but one person, did not return back to the school in the fall, and they had to hire a principal that year. And it was a train wreck. And the principal hiring didn't happen until May, and we all know, because of this, they had to get new people, find out who was on it. There was no record keep. I mean, this is all stuff I'm sure we all know. The records of who's on the SGC were completely wrong. And then finding people, getting people trained, to make sure that everybody's schedule who got trained could actually come. Like I said, it was until May that they were able to hire the principal, and we all know, like, just the timeline, I guess, with being able to bring in outside the district talent, whatever. I mean, that's not a good timeline for hiring. So I do want to share that and add that I do think that is that is something that I know that dating back 2.5 years ago, when I was first on the board and I was on the Family and Community Engagement Committee and we talked about this policy, was something that I know we discussed at length about changing that timeline to be October. And so I'm glad that we are going to make that change. But as far as the the requirements. I am curious to understand what is the statutory requirement.
Absolutely, and I can read it right to you, which I think is helpful because it's brief and it's very kind of plain language and easy to understand. One of the roles of the School Governance Council is participating in the hiring process for the school principal or other administrator of the school by conducting interviews of candidates and reporting on such interviews to the superintendent of schools for the school district and the local and regional board of education. That's it. It's quite thin.
So it's broad. It's broad. Like
the language is simple, but the obligation is broad, and that's why you've developed these procedures, these guidelines to help you further develop that process.
So I guess like that is again, maybe this is more of a comment around this idea that this is our, kind of moment to really engage on policy. And I think, we have the statutory requirements of things, and then it's like trying to figure out like how do we tweak obviously to comply with the statute is like the baseline. You can't go less than the statute, but like what more and difference that was still within the spirit of the statute and the language of the statute can we do around these issues. So I think that I want to say something about process in this too, because I do think that it's, I like that this is somewhat like how you would do a hearing on something if you were actually, drafting legislation or policy or something in terms of having the engagement and the input. I do think we should have, I think that it would be appropriate to have a longer public comment going forward, and I don't know if we can talk about this at the end or if I think that it would be helpful because, just like how you would have like, testimony on a bill or something, I think that would be helpful. And I also think it would be helpful to have had this discussion, or some of it, or at least having framed what the changes are and the rationale behind them before we had public comment so that we could have maybe more meaningful input on some of what we're changing. So those are just things that just came to mind as we are doing this. And I may have other substantive things that I want to ask, but I just wanted to share those.
Thank you. Ms. Brody and then Mr. Flores.
That date thing, that dates back to, I don't even think I had my youngest child and she's turning 9 next month. That changing that October thing. So that leads to one of my questions, which is how many hands touched this? Like how many groups because all of this was not done in policy committee, correct?
Correct.
So I asked the question and I don't think I got an answer I tried to ask weeks ago. This was changed not just in policy, it was maybe in your committee, Julio, maybe with some board staff. So we don't even, because the weight, if I'm reading this and I know who suggested what change, it will put it in perspective for me. But what I view this policy as is when a district really value parental input, right? So now I just think some of these changes, in my opinion, it takes the power it takes power away from parents. It makes it easier for the district to make decisions, but it depletes the parent voice in making decisions in the school. Some things are necessary, but some things here I'm uncomfortable with because I was once a parent who fought for these things that are in here, and now I'm the board member who's voting on those things being taken out. So I'm in a space that I'm uncomfortable with right now. And I understand some things. I'm not saying everything, because some things do prevent and make it harder for leadership to be put in place. But when we're making decisions where we're lessening the parent voice, I'm uncomfortable with that.
And I just want to highlight that we do have a policy committee meeting, and this is also for Ileana and Andrew, who gave public comment this evening. We have a policy committee meeting, Christina, Thursday? Yes. Thursday at 9:30 a.m. So we're going to talk about this process. Y'all looking at each other? What happened? Oh, okay. Everything okay? Okay. Thursday at 9:30 to really talk about the process that we're undergoing here this evening. And we, at the end of this whole process, we're going to reach a consensus on whether or not we'll be sending this back to policy committee for further discussion, or if other committees need to touch on it. So this is really the beginning of a dialogue. This is by no means like the end of the process. And this is by no means like the way that the process has to stay. So this is an opportunity for us to be able to engage in dialogue publicly around the board's key role in policy, because that's really what impacts people. So we'll have an opportunity to have that discussion on Thursday at 9:30, Christina. Awesome.
I was going to make a comment, and really addresses some of Ms. Browdy's concern. When I joined the board, Ms. Glanville was chair of the Family and Community Engagement Committee, and then I took over as chair. And we had been working on some of these changes, and not the ones relating to statute, because that's what you do, but the ones relating to how the SGCs work and so forth. And I had been chair of SGCs for 4 years at 2 different schools. So we had been discussing this for several years, even before the Office of Outreach was created and the function was under Dr. Colón Rivas. And we had his input, and Ms. Carla Cruz has been with us all along. And we worked closely with the leadership of Hartford Parent University, who provided a lot of important input. So I think that's how most of that came about. The areas relating to principal recruitment, and that's really an HR function, and I know and I've had many conversations with the superintendent as to her needs in trying to fill key positions in the district. But I also have a question for Ms. Black-Brown, and is, how have the SGCs been engaged in the process?
Thank you, Board Member Flores. And we smiled because from the last meeting, but that's okay. I can be Ms. Black-Brown to you. I have no problem with that.
Black Burke.
Black Burke, I'm sorry.
Like bird,
okay.
but with the
I always
Burke.
say Brown, I don't know why.
That is okay. So our SGCs have, you're asking the question, how have they been engaged with looking at this current policy?
Yes.
And I think you alluded to that very correctly, that prior to me coming into this seat and prior to the work that was done in the Family and Community Engagement Committee, that work was being done through HPU, and their staff is getting input from families, from the parents, through the SGCs. And that was how it was related to me as I came into this seat, and we looked to really lift up the policies and begin to work on the policies. Since then, Carla Cruz has been in contact with the SGCs, informing them that, okay, the policy is being looked at, inviting them out to the training in October. So that's how we've been engaging with the SGCs. And of course, if this policy were to be approved, then of course we would need to, one more time, every time we meet with the SGCs, every time we have a conversation, that is the idea behind the training, is going through each of the pieces of the policy to make sure that they themselves understand what's really written here in the policy. So coming into the seat, taking up the work where it kind of left off, and then carrying it through to where it is right now. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Carla.
I know we've been doing the work for over 2 years that I began to take the lead of the overseeing the SGCS last year. So I know that during the, not the policy committee, but the actual Family and Community Engagement Committee, we have been doing most of the work with a few parents. And I just want to let the board members know that, especially the alternate edits in the policy actually was by parents who attended the actual committee of the Family Community Engagement and recommended something to the actual committee that this is something that they were looking into adding to the policy because, as Ms. Williams mentioned before, there's a lot of vacancies and there's a process that we have to take. When there's a vacancy, there has to be an election process. And when we have already alternates that are already being elected and already participating in the trainings, they can automatically fill that role in the vacancies that are left in the middle of the year without costing the election process to re-engage and things like that. So those are the conversations that we have been having for the past 2 years as I'm being present to the SGCs. And I know we have shared in the SGC first training as a launch of opening to the SGCs the part of the principals interviews and the process. And I think it was from the committee, making sure that our families, if you're part of the principal interview process or not, that you are aware of this process. So we're beginning to have those conversations with our SGC members, our current SGC members again, beginning of October, when we received a new listing of SGC members. They were in the middle of process of elections, and we continue to include them in the conversations that we're currently having. And again, I'm speaking to the actual SGC members who are firmly elected as of right now, can't speak to the past SGCs.
Thank you. That's helpful. As you know, I believe strongly that we are in partnership with the parents. So it distresses me when I hear parents saying that they feel left out.
Likewise. So we spent quite a bit of time on the school governance council policy. So typically in terms, of course. So, but you're going to let me finish though. So typically in terms of the workshop, it usually is a conversation with the board and central office staff, typically for workshops. And so the public comment section was the opportunity for the public to give their feedback. However, on Thursday at 9:30, we have a... Okay, so I'm going to give you my cell phone number as chair of the policy committee, so that you can tell me exactly what your concerns are related to this policy, and we can make sure that we take them into consideration. And anyone else who needs that, like a direct email address, you can reach me at karen.taylor@trincoll.edu if you want to schedule time with me to discuss, because the policy committee times are not convenient for your work schedule. Yeah, okay. Pilot, it's a pilot. So unless people have anything specific and burning, Dr. Leslie Torres-Rodriguez?
I actually wanted to kind of step back and ask for clarification for Board Member Brody as to your statement around the changes. If you can highlight a change just so that I'm able to understand. I know you said there are several. Which one?
So one that's, and I didn't go into it because I thought in the policy committee is when we would get into that, but one, and I'm just saying one because I'm on page one, is it was a way that it was thought out when we're thinking the SGC. Sometimes you have parents who are both SGC parents and they're both PTO parents, but sometimes you have, some are just PTO, some are just SGC. So here, under the membership and election section, it said in collaboration, because the thought was we want the school governance council to collaborate with the parent-teacher organization in this process. So now is crossed out in collaboration with, and what's added is the PTO could assist in organizing. So could assist in organizing something, and being in collaboration with, that is a complete difference. So that's one thing that's stuck out to me on page one, because it was a way to make sure that these parent leaders were working in collaboration with other parent leaders. And then I understand the stress, right, Carla? You don't even have a functioning PTO. And that's why, and that brings us back to figuring this thing out. Why don't we have parents that are willing to serve in these roles? And that has been the hardest thing over, like, since I've had children in the Hartford public school system. But we have to figure it out. And I know this is an easy way. This is one of the examples that I said it's easier, but is it the right thing to do? Because you were having this collaboration, but now it's just like you could assist, but if you're not available to assist, then we'll just move on with this process. So trust me, I get it. I've always sympathized with schools who, they're trying to pull every trick out of the hat on how to get parents engaged. And I'm thinking if we have, and it starts, of course, with the building leadership, set the tone. We have parents, we have teachers who, if building leadership is being that role model to our teachers are on board, then that trickles down to teachers interacting with parents. And I'm like, you can't find, in this school, every teacher don't have one parent. Like in your class, you can't find one parent who would be willing. Like, I don't know what the strategy has to be, but I just think we shouldn't make it easier. We should make it good for our district and to benefit our district, and to make it look like parents are valued in this process and in this way. So that's just one thing. I don't know if you want more, but that's
Thank you for highlighting that. I think that I'll give Mr. Flores the last word on this, and then we'll talk about whether or not we are going to bring this to back to committee, or whether we're going to have a consensus to bring it for second read. Mr. Flores?
Yes, and I agree with Ms. Brody in principle, but I was one who pushed for this because my experience as the SEC chair at Burns is our principal left in November, and there was no functioning PTO. And at that time, I have a lot of time, so I'm retired. I used to be in the school every day. And I spoke to every teacher asking for recommendations of parent leaders. I spoke to our community partners, Compass and the Village. We sent out letters. We even had a raffle for people that came forward and offered their names, and we could not get a PTO together, and they didn't have a PTO until about 2 years later, and I believe there's some serious issues with that at that school now. And in the meantime, we had to find a principal. And I was actually being told at the time by HBOE and other parent leaders, you can't get an SGC if you don't have a PTO. I said, well, we have to have priorities here. We can't run a school if we don't have a principal. And it took a lot to get the SGC together, because it really is a lot of commitment on the parents' part, and we ask a lot of them. And sometimes it just, and I agree that there has to be a stronger move for engagement, trying to find ways to get the parents engaged, but we can't wait until that happens to hire staff. And we can't run a school without a principal. So I was in favor of this from the beginning, and that's my reason. At Burns, we didn't manage to select the principal until May. So he actually came in at the beginning of the next year, even though we'd been without a principal. We had a retired principal that had been asked to fill in, but she'd been gone in November.
I mean, I think that this is something that we run into often in policy committee, the aspirations that we hold for our district versus like the resources and the challenges that we face. So we can write whatever we want to write on paper, right? But it's people who are going to have to actually carry those things out. So this is a discussion that we can continue to have. Ms. Oliver, I'm not to call on you, but you haven't, I want to clear space in the event that you did want to say a thing.
No, yeah. First of all, I just want to thank my colleagues and staff for you guys' obvious experience and expertise. I'm not on the policy committee. And I had some questions. You guys were actually really good at answering some of them. I had questions around the numbers of alternates, how that was chosen, and things of that nature. Term limits, I don't know if that's a statutory requirement or not. That would be helpful for me to better understand. So maybe I should ask that question officially. So is the term limits, is that a statutory requirement or not?
It is.
Okay.
The language that was replaced here or put into this policy mirrors the language of the statute.
Okay.
And that's both for voting members and for the non-voting student members.
So how would it work if you're an alternate, that there's a vacancy and then you end up voting? Does that consider a term?
An excellent question. So the statute doesn't provide for alternates. That's something you have elected to do in your role as policy makers. And possibly that's something you'd want to consider identifying in the policy and clarifying. My interpretation without any additional language into the policy would be that that alternate would take the position of whomever has left and complete that term.
Okay.
But that's not to say that some other thing couldn't be clarified in the policy to say something different, such as at the end of that year, there's an election or something along those lines. But I see it as that alternate stepping into the role of the individual who is no longer on the committee.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. I don't know if we're to the point where we're planning on having a conversation about whether this moves forward or this goes back to committee.
That's next.
Okay.
I think that, Carla, you have something that you'd like to say?
I just want to clarify that it is correct, since alternate falls in the same election. So if I'm elected today, December 4th, that means that as an alternate, I'm also has the same term. So it will fill in the vacancy of the remaining of that term and will be eligible to run again for that position for the full term. But yes, I agree. And again, the policy, we tried in the committee, and this is something that Mr. Flores shared, we tried not to put too much in the policy, because it just, but having a process, and and I want to talk to Brody as well in regards to the PTO. There's no way that we want to eliminate that, but we have faced challenges, as Mr. Flores mentioned, in some schools where we can't get one, but we also have faced the challenges where PTO members all want to be part of the SGC, which becomes a conflict of interest, that if the PTO body, which is 4 members, want to participate as a parent, be elected as a parent in the SGC, cannot run elections as a conflict of interest for the SGC. But there is a process that we work together and put in a committee of election, and I have worked with that in several schools where I have come in and worked with parents, volunteer parents who are voluntary part of the process of the election, to have the process go through without the conflict of interest of the PTO members. So it's written in a way that it serves both ways, either when we can have a PTO body in the school, but also to those PTO members who want to participate on the SGC without creating the conflict of interest.
Yeah, because I know I was PTO and SGC at the same time. I do remember. But I do want to say that last I knew, the district receives Title I funds specifically for parental engagement, right? And we all know some schools do not even use the money, and it goes back to wherever it came from, right? So we get money to engage parents, and we don't even spend the money to engage the parents. So this is more than just not being able to find parents to fill these roles. This is not, in some cases it may be, not making the effort to spend the money in a way to engage parents. And then when you're engaging parents, you have access to more parents, right? And I'll end with this. When years ago we had this may be back in Adamowski days. We had a Title I liaison group, right? So there would be a liaison in the school, and it wasn't always a parent. It could be a staff member, FRA most times, and we would get together, not monthly, maybe quarterly, and we would every couple months, and we would come up with ideas and share them across schools. What did you do with your Title I funds? How did you engage parents? And we learned from each other, and we shared ideas on how to get parents out, how to get them involved. We knew our budget. We knew how to request money. We knew what we could spend it on, what we couldn't spend it on, and we don't even do that anymore. And we have money from the federal government to engage parents, and we don't use it. You see the list, use, and it just goes right back. So that is what we can we can start there. And being, because you have to spend it in a certain way, and we supported each other as from school to school. So we have to make efforts, and I know it's hard, but we have to make more of an effort to engage parents.
So at this time, I will pose the question to my colleagues as to whether we will bring this back up for a second read or whether this policy needs to return to committee. I just want to highlight that even in the process, if it goes for a second read, there will be another discussion similar to this one. So I think that I've been asked to kind of formalize a process that's pretty informal actually at this juncture because we're generating consensus. So maybe we'll start with Ms. Brody, and then we'll just go board member by board member, and you'll let me know whether you feel as though it should go for a second read or back to committee, and then for it to come back up for a first read. Yes, Ms. Glanville?
Can you just clarify, going back, I mean, we're having a committee meeting, even if it goes for second read, we're still going to have
Yes.
another committee meeting.
We'll have another
though,
conversation.
before second read.
Yes.
Because of the, okay. Just,
I say back to committee.
Thank you. Ms. Oliver?
I actually say back to committee. Just want to give some context to why. One of the comments made tonight, and it appeared to be agreed upon, was many hands was in this document. We talk a lot about the responsibility of board members and what's our responsibility versus what's the superintendent, and we talk about this being one of the three. I would feel more comfortable with my colleagues who are in policy committee to say we have fully vetted this and we feel that these are our words, and then bringing that back forth to us.
Thank you for your comment and your vote. Mr. Flores?
I would bring it back to committee.
Thank you so much. Ms. Glanville?
I can't answer this in one response, but is this only to bring it back to the policy committee, or could we also bring it back to like the family engagement committee, to the point, to Ms. Oliver's point around? So I think like that would actually be, I think it would be helpful to have it, given the comments that we're hearing, and that this is like going to the core of engagement, that it could actually, not to give you more work, Mr. Flores.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's part of the process, but I
Yeah.
would think that's
So
where
once
we should
have
send this.
Once we have ownership of it back in policy committee, we have the ability to send it out to any other committee that feels as though they need to have their eyes on it. We could even have a meeting, committee of a whole week that's open for discussion. So once it comes back to policy committee, we could also forward it on to family and community engagement. That could be a conversation, many ways to approach it. So not just back to our committee, it can go back to, for committee discussions among the board members. Yeah. Is that your vote? Okay. That's not one of the options. You're going to have to vote for a second read or back to... Okay. So, but back to committee. Okay. And so my vote is for it to go back to committee because clearly this is an issue that lots of people would like to continue to discuss. We'll kind of like... I think that it's really important to be able to look at what the statutory requirements are versus what we do as a district. I think in many ways we create a lot more work for ourselves because, and even here tonight in this packet, the regulations aren't even attached to policy. So there is just a whole world of things that we create around I'm sorry, Gwen, I forgot your last name.
Zatoun.
What Mr. Toon read to us was really a brief snippet in comparison to the 7-page document that doesn't even include regulations. So I agree to bring it back to committee and for us to really think through the intent of this policy and to make sure that it's functioning true to its intent. Okay? So, policy 1211s on school governance councils will return to policy committee from whence it came. Okay. And so we're going to move on to the next policy, which is 5131, conduct and discipline. I'm going to check in with Christina and see if we have any speakers on this. Oh, we do? Okay. All right, great. So first we're going to do an introduction of the policy by Dr. Vasquez Matos.
Thank you. The second policy in front of us is actually the student discipline policy. The focus of looking into this policy and revising many of this policy, number one, is actually statutory regulations that have been released, some last year and some currently over the summer, that needed to actually be reflected in our policy, but also actually with the guiding principles of the DME, when we're talking about the priorities of culture and climate, chronic absenteeism, and things of that sort. How does this current policy actually help support the priorities and the major actions that are actually outlined in the district model of excellence? And as we begin after public comments, I can give more of an overview of the major changes and the theoretical rationale behind the changes.
So Dr. Vasquez Matos, we have no public comment on this, so you can go straight on into contextualizing this document for us.
Thank you once again.
Back to you.
The theoretical rationale behind this is actually, how do we create policy around embracing student voice, allowing for due process for students, but also making sure that in all our day-to-day operations, interactions with our students, that interventions are actually provided for students before we get to kind of the disciplinary consequences. While there is statutory regulations around certain behaviors and certain unwanted behaviors and what the consequences should be, there are others also that do not fall within those clear statutory requirements that really can actually create a different reality for our students during their time in our schools. So how do we create policies that actually support student voice, create the conditions of achievement in our schools, but also making sure, like we say in our DME, allow students and staff to really feel safe and valued in all our schools. And the work that's actually been done in this policy will also support actually the code of conduct, which is currently being updated. Tomorrow is actually going to be, it was actually sent to the citywide student senate for them to review and provide feedback. And tomorrow they'll be meeting with the superintendent to provide their feedback to the updates of the code of conduct, because a lot of the work that's around that code of conduct is around restorative practices, interventions, what can be done. And just a real life example, you know, I met with the team from the Office of the Chief of Schools today and talking to them about suspensions and expulsions, and making sure that we're asking the right questions from our school leaders before we come to those type of decisions. What interventions have been made and provided for our students? Has the due process at the local school level been in place and provided to our students? But also making sure that the checks and balances, especially our students, our most vulnerable population, making sure that those students actually, before decisions are made, their rights are actually protected. And that Dr. Sellers and her team are involved now in many of the decisions before we get to those decisions. So with that said, I respectfully ask that Dr. Sellers and Chief Yvette Avila join me as we begin to discuss this policy. So if you look throughout the policy, again, it's a lot of it is the red strike-throughs, but also the blue is actually language that has been added. And a lot of the wording is actually basically to align with statutory language, but also embracing student voice and students' due process throughout. So
I think that if you have a copy, it's not in color, right? So you have things that have like the strike through, right? So those are the things that are being removed, obviously, and then the things that are kind of in that light gray and are underlined, those are the additions. Okay.
Sure. So some changes that overarching changes is making sure that we actually record and log student behavior in the appropriate data. So we call the data warehouse. So we call it our system the Power School system, where it is. The notification timeline, but previously the document also one of the most and I learned this the hard way last year when I came on board is actually who actually makes the recommendation or the approval for suspension, and overall it was actually held at the local level. So never was there kind of a conversation between supports that can happen from central office to make sure students actually receive those supports. So now there's actually a due process where any recommendations that come, for example, expulsion, has to go to certain offices and finally to the office of the superintendent before an expulsion is actually approved. So it would have to go through the Office of Student Support Services and Special Education, sign off. It would then have to go to the chief of schools and her team to sign off, and finally the superintendent before a decision is made for expulsion. So these are kind of some of the things that have happened in changing of these languages. Hearing notices, again, making sure that there is a time frame and not things end up in limbo and parents are not notified on time or students are notified on time. And making sure that people are clear about the hearing process and so forth, about the role of the hearing masters, which is appointed by the board when it comes to expulsion hearings and so forth. I'll stop there. I will allow Ms. Taylor to guide us to the next steps.
So this policy actually, all policies that are related to discipline are kind of things that I really look at closely, right? Just because poverty and punishment are so closely interlinked in society. So I think that whenever we're looking at student discipline policies, it's really critical, especially for our district, to make sure that we are definitely taking into consideration the demographic of our students, but also kind of not deviating from what is standard and the norm, right? In terms of like what our neighbors are doing, what is the statutory kind of responsibility that we have, and also in terms of like implementing best practices around restorative justice and the like. So I don't know if I can maybe give you all an opportunity to speak to some of those things, and then myself and I'm sure a few of my colleagues have a conversation around this.
All right, good evening, everyone. So the policy really sets the parameters. And our code of conduct, which Dr. Vasquez-Matos explained where exactly that is in terms of we're letting students review it so that we can have that student voice and that student perspective in there. And then our departments, the chief of schools and then Office of Student Support Services, we're also going through the document, really pouring through it, kind of scrubbing the document, making sure that those restorative practices that we've now allowed for in the policy, the policy has sort of been opened up to allow for those restorative practices to be enacted. We're really deconstructing what that means on a school campus when we're talking about creating a code of conduct. that's really kind of shifting away from being a technical assistance manual on infractions and offenses and becoming a guideline for student engagement and positive and proactive behavior support. Those nuts and bolts of due process are in there, but that's probably, how the code of conduct really reflects the policy in terms of us creating that document, that guidance document for, like I said, positive and proactive behavior support. The focus of that document is really on establishing that continuum of environmental and systemic supports and safeguards that are intended to improve learning and behavioral outcomes for students. The document now includes our Hartford Public Schools values and beliefs. So that's built in to the preamble, and I've shared a draft with our Teaching and Learning Committee. So we really set the tone of that entire document, talking about our values and beliefs and how those values and beliefs should guide every single board employee in really cultivating a positive culture and climate here at Hartford Public Schools. You'll note it in the Code of Conduct, again, creating more of a support document. There's removal of language. You mentioned, codes of conduct and discipline policies, being very punitive in nature. And we've really scrubbed the document for language that's really kind of associated with criminality, offenses, violations, infractions, and it's really more centered on the types of behavior we want to see from students. Student behavior that's consistent. That is actually the language that we use. We're talking about student behavior that is consistent with established school community norms, values, practices, rules, and regulations. And when we talk about incidents, again, moving away from words like offense, violation, infraction, we're looking at student behavior that can be shaped, but that might be inconsistent with those community values and those community expectations. So we do have instructive responses and corrective responses built into the Code of Conduct. Has a student been taught what to do? Have they been told? Do they know? Do they really understand what the expectations are? And if in the moment they may be engaging in behavior that's inconsistent with those expectations, how are we allowing for that corrective response in order for them to consider and rethink their behavior and possibly, engage in some alternative behavior that's more in line with community norms. It really includes investigating those underlying conditions that caused maybe this incident in the first place. It will include procedural guidelines for due process at all levels. It includes facilitative dialogue, restorative conferences, and it really enables the student. It really is centered on the student being empowered to be accountable for their actions, to actively be accountable for their actions, and to propose ways in which they might address their behavior that was inconsistent with school norms, community norms, and values.
Dr. Sellers, just to make a connection, if you will look at your page 3 of your policy, on number 3 in the bottom where it says actions, you can see how we added that language to kind of reflect of what Dr. Sellers is saying.
Right.
Action is changed to consequence, and then right under it, it clearly articulates that the principal of the school or designee of the administrative staff of the school shall have the right to use restorative and progressive methods of discipline to ensure that disciplinary consequences on number 1, are age appropriate, fair, address the underlying problem that may have led to a disciplinary consequence, 4, teach the desired replacement behavior, and 5, are focused on repairing harm, and 6, are designated to help students and staff and families work together to maximize productive student learning time. So all of this is a change of language on increasing student performance, but also creating that climate of student achievement that you want for a student, and not so punitive, but restorative.
So, Dr. Sellers, I just want to say that I'm really appreciative of the vision that you hold around restorative justice. I do have some questions, particularly, and if I can just kind of take a little latitude to do this, particularly around culture, right? So we've scrubbed the document of some of these punitive, like criminalizing language, but how are we, given our resource challenges, actually meeting the needs of students around restorative justice? Because a lot of that is linked to adults having close relationships with students, right, within the school. And some of our schools we often talk about in policy committee don't have behavior techs and that sort of thing. Like, this is a resource question where we have school safety officers who are being called in to provide discipline in classrooms, and, you know, so if you can just speak to how we are. So we definitely have it in the document, the language is visionary, but how are we doing this in practice given our resources?
Right. So I'll mention a few things, and then I'll let Chief Avila talk about specific leadership dispositions in terms of principals who are leading their schools. But we do have a professional learning plan that really is centered on our trauma-informed work and creating a trauma-sensitive environment. Part of our continuum of supports is beginning with RAP, restorative approaches and practices, positive behavior interventions and supports, and then all of that through a trauma-informed lens. So we're at different levels of our organization, providing professional learning opportunities for our school counselors, our school social workers, our school psychologists, our mental health clinicians, our behavior techs, our school SPOs. So there we now have opportunity for them to come to CPI training to learn a more restorative, trauma-informed approach to managing student behavior once a student does become dysregulated. But we're really trying to touch all levels of our organization in providing professional learnings in terms of the tools and skills that are going to help us really kind of cultivate that more positive climate and culture. So it is written into the code of conduct, but that's a part of our professional learning plan, is to make sure that our staff, understand the impact of trauma, that they understand what positive, universal, proactive supports look like for behavior, everything from reducing risk that a behavior will occur in the first place to providing a therapeutic intervention for a student. So we do have a plan for professional learning for our staff to kind of roll out at all levels elements that are really important to climate and culture in terms of tools, skills, dispositions, and infusing that at all levels.
Thank you so much. So unless people need additional context around this particular policy, we'll move into the board Q&A. Do people need additional contextual information on the policy? I'm looking at you, you don't need it. You got it. Okay. So Ms. Glanville and then Mr. Flores.
Thank you. So I have a question about bias and discretion. And so a couple of as I'm reading through this, and I think I understand there's a lot of discretion, right, and given to the principal to use restorative practice for reasons that are good, right? But I wonder, and I guess I'm raising this because, of course, we know that there is, there's data and statistics, like, and given our district showing that students of color are more disparately disciplined nationwide, right? And so I just, and one of the things we also know about discretion is that discretion is also something that can be very tainted by bias. And so I'm just wondering, like, do we have, how in this policy, are we accounting for accountability around that, and also tracking that? I know that we have various data that we look at and things like that. Are we sure that we are going to be actually accountable for looking at that and actually having some measure in here for that kind of accountability in the way that we're framing it? That is one of my questions, and then I can wait and let you answer that and ask the other one.
So are you asking about there being a bias being addressed right in the code of conduct?
Well, I'm saying that because in the policy, for reasons that are understandable, there is a lot of discretion to the building leader for how to use particular tools, right? And obviously encouragement of restorative of tools, but there's still this discretion given. So how, and like I said, we know that bias can taint discretion. So, and we have data and statistics nationwide. And so I just, in particular, the district that we're in, do we need to put language somewhere in here about equity and or naming bias? I mean, I think that is, when you're creating policy, like, you have to, you don't want to be too specific, right? Sometimes because then but is this an area where we need to be more specific given our context and given our district and given the national data and our own data on this, and want to make sure we actually hold ourselves accountable to our data on this.
Well, thank you for explaining, because I wanted to make sure that I really understood your question. So part of our approach to, our restorative approaches and practices in circles, that work does begin to get at bias and implicit bias, having individuals who are engaged in shaping student behavior really kind of look at the situation in its entirety in terms of who's been harmed, who was harmed, who's been harmed, what needs to be restored. So there isn't anything explicit in that in the code of conduct. That might be something that we definitely want to add, but I would say that that's part of the due process that we're adding to the code of conduct at every single level. I mean, from the most basic classroom level of an issue of insubordination, for instance. So that due process will be a part of this. And it really does involve deconstructing the incident and what happened and make sure we have a clear understanding of what happened. Like you said, there's a lot of discretion, but our Chief Avila, equity is something that she is really centered on in terms of guiding the leaders of our schools. And we do look at that data. We look at our racial and ethnic, all disparities in our data in OSS and ISS, and that is something that we're highly cognizant of when we review on a weekly basis our ISS and OSS data. So I think there's an opportunity in the document certainly to make sure that we're explicitly calling out that language that refers to equity, and I mean, we could certainly talk through maybe adding, like I said, language that's really explicit in terms of how we are reviewing the situations.
I would recommend, though, to add to that, is that I think the board with the superintendent needs to have future conversations of really creating a racial equity policy that guides all work, not just discipline, but in all the work that we do, the hiring practices, the discipline, and so forth. It's many districts have had these conversations where they've created some racial equity policy that guides the work and the operation of the school district and many of the decisions, which creates kind of a through line through all policies. So it's something to start thinking about and talking about. So that would be my recommendation.
Thank you. Did you want to add?
I just wanted to add, as though it's not in the policy, that we are working with administrators in regard to equity, and it happens at the Administrative Institute. Several of we had teams that went to an Equity Institute and turnkey the actual experiences that they have. So there will be a focus, and has been some focus on equity as far as equitable leadership, and so that we can begin to embed equity in everything that we do as part of our our DME and our major priorities. But again, I hear what you're saying in regard to the policy in particular.
Yeah. Well, and so my second question is, I think if this is, I mean, this is something that comes up, I think, in a lot of our policy discussion is like the issue of accountability, right? Because this is where the board, I mean, we don't get into the operations and the administrative side of things, like, and this is, you know, and we don't want to be too specific, right? Because we're supposed to be setting sort of the broader guidelines, but I think there is always this question around accountability. This is the one sort of chance that the board has to set the parameters of what people will be held accountable to. So that is why I asked the question in terms of that. And then also, this is similar to that, and it's more specific issue. Would this policy be the place where you would put in, sort of add like non-negotiable things, again, around accountability for something like recess cannot be withheld as a punishment? And I say that because we've heard public comment about that. It's an issue that I am aware of in some of our schools, and I want to say it was maybe 2 board meetings ago we had somebody speak about that as public comment, and I mean, I personally don't think that should be, you know, withheld as punishment, and I think that it might even be illegal.
It is.
Yes. But I think it's an issue. So, and maybe there are other issues similar. So is this the place where we would put something in like that is like, we're saying the things that you can do, right? But like, is there a list of things, a deeper list of things that we need to say that you absolutely can't do?
If I could just briefly comment, so there is a specific state statute that says you may not pull recess away for disciplinary purposes. Bit of an echo. And we have previously recommended a separate standalone policy that just specifically says that, along with some other language, so that it is very clear in a standalone place, and not, this is quite a long policy. It's not something you would want necessarily to get buried, although it certainly could be added. But it's state statute, so you don't necessarily need a policy on that resource.
I'm sorry, y'all better send an email to the entire Hartford Public School staff. I'm serious. That's the number one, you're not going out for recess. That is not understood. I understood it, but I'm serious. We are in major violation. Because think about what you want to do most, you want to go to recess. So it's
So we intend to put it in the code of conduct explicitly. And so we're in the process of still working on the code of conduct, but it will be in the code of conduct as well as a separate statute.
Mr. Flores?
Thank you. And Ms. Glanville, as an attorney, can speak objectively and calmly about things, but for me, actually, this is very personal. Because now, my son is now paying a very heavy price for a process that I believe was totally unjust. And Dr. Sellers is very familiar with the case because I approach her about it almost weekly. But I am concerned about the discretion. I'm concerned that about saying that the administration has the right to use a restorative response. Why not a requirement that they do? And I understand, as a member of the Teaching and Learning Committee, Ms. Avila and Dr. Sellers come to us every month, and I know that you have a very heavy lift because in many areas we're asking people to do their work in a different way. So we have to train about 3,000 people to do their work in a different way. But this is people's lives that we're affecting. If in a school they're not equipped, can we not bring someone in from another place to look at the case and see what we can do for this child? I'm really concerned about this. I don't think it should be optional.
If I may just add one piece, that there's a narrow reason, a few narrow reasons that a Board of Education must expel a student. I just want to put that out there so that there has to be some language worked in for those 3 narrow exceptions. But obviously hearing what you're saying. Yeah, just wanted to make that clear also.
Ms. Oliver?
Number one, I completely agree with a board member, Flores, in the feeling of restorative practices. I have a question, though. You mentioned there's some specific language that must be in the policy. Does it include the conduct off school grounds? Yes. Because we're already talking about discretion, and I feel like then you're adding a whole nother space that goes even beyond, because it talks into interpretation where it suggests that the staff was not there to actually witness, and I'm not seeing that here, so I'm just wondering, what are we required legally?
Absolutely, and it is written in here. It's a very dense policy. So there are reasons that a school may discipline for off-campus conduct. That is limited.
I'm sorry,
to,
just one second.
Yes.
That's on page 3, if people are following.
Right,
of the
so
policy.
I want to be clear. I'm not questioning it being in here.
Yes.
I'm questioning what the state law is.
says.
Yes.
And what is written in here is what state law says. So in order to discipline a student for off-campus conduct, generally, I'm not talking about the mandatory reasons, but the permissible reasons, is when essentially there's a nexus with the school. So there has to be some connection made with the school in order to discipline a student for conduct that doesn't happen on school grounds or at a school-sponsored activity. I'm talking about completely off school grounds, not at, for example, an off-campus activity like a football game or what have you, an athletic event or other activity. And there are some standards that are used in the statute and written in this policy as to what the administration or the board, if the board is being asked to review an expulsion request. And those are items such as, and I'm probably not going to be able to list them all, but if it involves drug activity or alcohol or involvement of other students in the school or gang involvement, those are specifically written to the statute, replicated here in the policy. The other reason, and that means that the student has also violated a Board of Education policy. So the student violated the policy, and then there was the connection with the school, and that there's notice, which is what this policy and your code of conduct does. It gives that notice. There's also mandatory reasons to expel a student if they engage in certain behavior off school grounds. That involves the sale or distribution of drugs, illegal drugs, whether it occurs off school grounds or on school grounds. There must be a referral for an expulsion, and then the process is to hold a hearing before the Board of Education or the appointed hearing officer, and the case is put on as to whether it actually occurred. But state statute requires an expulsion if it's proven that the student distributed or sold drugs off school grounds or on school grounds. The other off school grounds is if a student possessed a firearm in violation of Connecticut law, very specific law written, or possessed and used a firearm, dangerous instrument, deadly weapon in the commission of a crime off school grounds. So those are it's very specific, narrow reasons that are identified here, and the language in your policy mirrors the state statute.
So, and I really appreciate this time, by the way, again, colleagues and staff who have been very deep in this language. So I thought I saw something like, you can have a firecracker, and there is consideration if somebody believes that was disruptive to the learning experience, that now they have discretion on how they actually manage that at the school. For me, that's an example of, wow, that's a lot of room to wiggle in. I don't know what the fix is of that. I usually don't like to bring up things without having some, recommendation or something. But it just is one of those moments where I just think about, wow, so we can have young people with their friends with firecrackers, and we talked about inherent bias a little earlier and what that possibly could do. And so I love the idea of having a race equity policy that actually is just a through line through all of our work. I think that's really important, and for something for us to consider, Committee Chair Taylor. But that's an example of one that, or some of you know the work that I do, when, I actually am getting paid to do work, involves young people who are usually on these sides of the conversation. So it's those conversations. And my last thing while I have the floor here is skipping class It didn't jump out at me, but can someone speak to how skipping class leads young people to out of school suspension, or in like that role that play? If you can help me with that, or like as a clarification.
Say that again? Oh. We did talk about that. And so in previously, there was part of the policy that where children who skipped class after other interventions did not work were supposed to have suspension in the previous policy. It was stated in a policy.
I'm sorry, Chief Avila. Are we saying it's in the policy now?
No, we took it out.
Okay,
but it was previously. You wanted to know what happened. We took it out, so that's
so
we had discussion
so
about
it's
that.
fully out. Thank
Yes.
you. Thank you.
So I wanted to go back to Mr. Flores's comments around why, I guess, like restorative practices are optional. Like Ms. Oliver, the work that I do for a check is actually in diversity and inclusion, and we often talk about removing biases, not necessarily from people because that's impossible, but removing them from processes. So can you speak a little bit as to why, particularly in our district where people's quality of life long-term, literally on the line for maybe things that may happen when they're young, right? Mistakes that other people, if they have resources or family that are willing to kind of like step in, maybe send them to another district or send them away to a school, can kind of overcome. But for our students, many of them, this is dire, right? So if they don't get that K through 12 education, their quality of life long-term is significantly diminished. So can we talk about why restorative justice practices are optional, particularly in our district?
So I'll start and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Sellers. But on page 3, and where it talks about leading disciplinary consequences, including removal of class and suspension expulsion, when we have to, under the regulations of the guidelines where we have to suspend, not that it's a choice, but that is by state mandate, then that's not necessarily considered restorative at that moment, right? And so that's why some of the language has to be that it can't be all of the time, but that we have to follow the regulation of the state that when, for example, if it was a firearm, right, that we have no choice but to suspend. That doesn't mean that when they re-enter or how it's happening in the discussions that lead up to that are not restorative, right? So helping a student understand that that was a poor choice and the danger in which it brings to themselves and possible harm to others is a restorative conversation, and the entry plan for them to return back to school, that you made a poor choice. It's not about the individual, it's about the action, and that they will return in an environment that is still caring and really embrace them coming back and honoring them as an individual and still value them is the restorative piece.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. Much like the students who are skipping class or then ultimately suspended, the 3 instances that are given as justification for expulsion seems to me like individuals who are already on a path, young people who are already on a path of like deviating from school. And it's like, oh, so like if you are in a life of crime trying to, support some sort of alternate economy, we're going to just push you further into that situation and circumstances that you're in. This is not for you two lovely folks at the table. This is probably an opportunity for us to do some state advocacy when we're thinking about like these 3 specific reasons for expulsion. So just want to highlight that for our legislative agenda, baby. We're going all the way. Okay, great. That's helpful. Does anyone else have comments, or Ms. Brody?
I have 2. Maybe they're clarifying. So that back to the conduct off school grounds. So there's a part that said whether the conduct involved violence, threats of violence, or the unlawful use of a weapon as defined in section blah, blah, blah. Or if any injuries, and whether any injuries occurred. So that that's any fight you have any time of day in the neighborhood or anywhere. Is it that broad?
So the language that you've just read is statutory, and there are factors that may be considered, and it, I think, very importantly says may be considered but shall not be limited to the following factors. So these are considerations that either the administration, when suspending or otherwise disciplining, or the Board of Education, when moving to expel, may use to determine whether that was seriously disruptive of the educational process. And that's just exactly how the statute's written, and that's why it's replicated here. Those are factors that can be considered.
That's not how I known this section to be. Like I've always heard, if they're on their way home from school, if they didn't go home first, and all of these made up stuff that I don't see here. Like if the student was on their way home from school and they got off the bus and had a fight, but they didn't go home first, that is considered still part of you're still in the care of the school district. And like a lot of different versions of, like if the student didn't go to your same school. And so I was looking through this trying to see something to even make sense of that. Like I understand you're on a school bus, you're still on your way home, but if you walk home but you didn't go home first, or I read somewhere if it was in within a proximity of the school. But so you're saying that if it's causes some disruption to the school, like because if you get into a fight with somebody, if y'all go to the same school, y'all coming back to school, so it's an issue and it's connected to the school. But if you're just someone you see, but you didn't go home for, like that part was never described, and I think it's going back to the discretion thing, right? So if you're able, and I even know of instances that hit close to home that it was something that happened not even right after school, right? And the school officer is actually trying to find what to his other school officer friends, do this student go here, just trying to make a connection. So the disciplinary infraction can happen. So we have to be very clear. This is just so vague, and I just know of a lot of things that have happened, and I'm trying to make sense of them within this policy, and I don't see it, and it just seemed like it was someone's perception, or even under their authority, what they're able to do in the school building pertaining to particular students. This opened a lot up for me to further look into. But I have a question in regards to, it was a word here, and it was so on page, I believe it's 5, number 6, on any act of harassment based on. So it previously said an individual's sexual orientation, race, color, religion, disability, national origin, or ancestry. And it was changed to any actual or perceived. That perceived part is what I need clarification on. And I'll give you an example. A student's, which is more common now in our schools than previous, right? Gender identity and that sort of thing. And I'm not even an expert on it. But if a student who is not aware of that, and they're saying she, and then the individual goes by a he, and you're getting in trouble because you keep saying she. So I'm trying to understand how, like the children, they have to be like knowledgeable about what you're violating, and know what you're doing wrong. Because if you don't understand it, you're going to violate it, especially around that sensitive area, instead of the adult saying, just don't talk to them. Because then you're isolating them. So you might want to communicate, but you're doing it wrong. And, you know, so I think our students have to know about these things, because if you can violate it, so that perceived, the word perceived is what I want a little bit of clarification on.
Ms. Brody, you are on page 5, you said? Or page 4?
Because the 5 is below it. Oh, so the page number is on top?
Yeah, so page 4,
of the page? Yeah. Okay.
Page 4, number 6?
It's 4. Number 6, yeah.
Yeah, number 6. Number 6. And can you restate your question?
So it was just based, so it was saying an act of harassment based on an individual's blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But the language is changed to any actual or perceived. Now, so we're saying perceived, so is it the person who's being maybe feel like they're harassed? Because I could say I feel harassed if you keep on calling me she, referring to me as a female, and I view myself as a male, but the person who's the violator, I guess, or the harasser does not know. So I'm trying to understand, if we're saying perceived, I would like a little more.
There are times when students or adults, whomever, might consider, make a judgment call of what a person feels their sexual identity is, for example, right? Because of body motions, because of the way they talk, or for whatever bias they personally might have, and they begin to identify that person in a particular way. That's their perception about that person, with that person without saying I am, or I want to be called she, or I want to be called he, right? So it's their perception that they are something or someone without them actually having a conversation or honoring that person's identity. And then it becomes that other person feels uncomfortable and feels that they're being harassed, that's happening because they're not uncomfortable with what's being said or what's being done to them. So I don't know if that helps clarify it.
I have so this is actually the work that I do for a check. And I think that people can tell when you are being mean-spirited, and people can tell when you have a learning around a particular thing, particularly around gender identity. I also think that this is a learning in that if we're teaching our kids to interact in the world in 2018, this is going to have to be a learning actually at all ages and all levels.
Absolutely.
So for that specific instance that you gave, Ms. Brody, I think that people can, in terms of the word harassment, people can tell when you are genuinely concerned and care, and when you are trying to harass them and repeatedly call them an alternative pronoun, even though you've already explicitly told them what your pronouns are, right? So that would be like my individual expertise.
For this case, and I'm not an expert on it, but I'm assuming you can feel like you are female this month, and then next month you can feel like you're male. So that, and those kind of things, I think our students just have to be made aware, because I don't know that this month that's what you're identifying with. So if they're going to be penalized for it, I'm just struggling with that.
I mean, specifically around pronouns, I think that if you're unsure, you can just call a person by their name. That usually kind of fixes that problem. You don't have to call me she or he. You can call me Karen. And I think that should also be like a learning and a conversation that we're having in classrooms, particularly when people are thinking about, you should see the list of pronouns. Even where I work, we're moving to like 6 gender markers coming up in 2019 for people to be able to select from, and how individuals identify is solely like their right, and it's up to them. And I think that that should definitely be something that we're having conversations with our students about if they want to just operate in the world, right? And there are some sort of best practices thing, like you can ask people what their pronouns are, and you can also just call people by their names.
But that
for
has to be
specific
taught
instance.
to students who are not, that's not the world they are operating in outside of school.
Yes.
And because it's in school, you have to school them on this is how we deal with that here. So I think we have to.
We certainly do, but I also think that like the bar for harassment versus like a lack of awareness around, like I think that those are like two different things. It's like, oh, like I'm not familiar with this versus I'm gonna keep on calling you something that you specifically asked me not to call you. I think that that's like the difference.
Or even the choice of words, right? Harassment. So if someone who has, an individual who might have mannerisms or so forth that would make the person assume that the person is gay because he's male, that's and hence words are used in a very harassed way, then that's a perceived characteristics because it might not be true. So you're using a perceived notion, and then you go into this harassment mode of using words and things that offend the individual, and vice versa. So that can be called out. But to Ms. Taylor's point, I think there's a learning opportunity for us as we create these safe schools. Is how do we create those environments where a mistake is a mistake and it can be a learning opportunity, while harassment is something that you can probably pinpoint and actually correct with consequences. And I go back to when we created gender-neutral bathrooms and the experience back in the other district. That was, a learning opportunity for many individuals of what does that mean and so forth and how you identify. So, but at the same time protecting the dignity of the individual, regardless of any of these aspects. I think that's the ultimate goal, is how do you respect the dignity of the individual at all times. And that's through learning opportunities.
But I will say probably this is, and I was actually going to turn it right to you because I think that this is a language question, right? So why are we saying any act of harassment based on any actual or perceived versus just saying any act of harassment based on differentiating character? Like, why don't we go right into that? Are you able to?
And this was language that didn't come out of my recommendation,
Yep,
right?
we did this.
You did this, and so which is perfectly fine, but I don't think any reason that you couldn't just go right into it and not say the actual or perceived. I wanted to hit on the harassment piece because the concept of harassment includes intent. Right. And so what you were speaking to is entirely legitimate in that we have to educate our students, but if it's not intentionally picking on or what have you a student for these characteristics, then that's not harassment, by definition, which is a different policy that we have on harassment. But it's intent, and it's about educating the students and educating the staff and administrators on how to implement this, which is part of what the Code of Conduct does.
But Ms. Brody, to your point, we can definitely, whether this goes back to committee or comes up for a second read, we can look specifically at those 4 words that may or may not need to be there within this particular policy. Yes, Ms. Glanville?
Can I get a request?
Sure.
And I don't know if we could do this, but related to some of the points that my colleagues have been raising around the restorative justice piece of this and a desire to see that it's mandatory, to see it be something that's more mandatory. I think it could be helpful to have like a resource analysis done. I mean, so because like, I know I mentioned before, like policy is how we can hold ourselves accountable. Policy also dictates how we have to allocate resources, right? And our accountability dictates that. So I think, and the reason why I just brought it up in this context is because I know it was several meetings ago when we voted on the restorative justice contract to expand our current restorative justice practices, which I voted in favor of. But one of the questions that I had and one of the reservations that I have, and I still have, is just taking a portfolio approach to doing restorative justice, that it's sort of like this school by school thing, and we've been gradually growing it, and we're talking here today about wanting to see this be something that is like not a non-negotiable thing. But understanding, as I think was explained to us when we had that contract before us, that that's very expensive to actually give staff the training to be able to actually comply with a policy that made it a mandatory thing. And also, I think there was some mention that it wasn't even, I think that it was explained that it wasn't even necessarily the correct, most effective approach, because it really requires schools individually to take ownership over these practices instead of like it being a top-down approach. So this is my long-winded way of saying, like, this is that question about whether this could be something mandatory raises almost like a resource analysis question that I have. Like, is that even something that we could do? What would it take for us in our budget-making decisions to... Because I don't think we're at that place now from a resources perspective where we could say that in a policy if we wanted to, and I think we have a desire to have that as a non-negotiable, but we don't have the capacity. We certainly haven't allocated the resources now. Can we have sort of an analysis around that in relation to this? Is that something for like finance committee or?
Yes. The other piece that I would add to that is around just the human capital capacity to implement the work as well, right? And the space to have the conversation around the priorities, so around school culture, climate, and all of our students feeling safe and valued alongside and in tandem with everything else. For us to have a scaled approach to the work.
Right. So one thing I want to add is, first, I just appreciate everybody's input. Regarding, the use of the word optional, right? So you used the word optional, and then you were talking about, is a restorative approach mandatory? So, I mean, we really appreciate your insight, because we want to make sure that the way it's written doesn't imply that a restorative approach is optional. So the language we had in there did allow for times when a statute might supersede. So I think that was really the purpose of having the school shall have the right. So I thank you for that insight, because perhaps we could word it, we could say, except where superseded by statute, restorative and progressive methods of discipline, because these are our regulations that are coming right out of that policy. So they're not optional. And so I want to say, in talking about, the contract for our the person that's coming in and training our school teams on restorative approaches and practices, these restorative and progressive methods of discipline, they're a part of that, but they can certainly still be a part of a code of conduct, and we can have explicit guidance into how we use restorative and progressive methods. We have 5 cohorts, so we did expand that policy. We have more schools participating, but when a school isn't necessarily, when they haven't applied to be a RAP school and have a RAP team, that doesn't mean that they won't enact restorative methods of discipline that are outlined in this code of conduct. So I want to make sure that that's clear. Because this, we don't, and I think the Chief Avila agrees, we don't consider this to be optional, except where it's superseded by statute. That restorative and progressive approach to discipline will be used, and that guidance will be explicit in the code of conduct. So I hope maybe that clarifies
No, it does.
feeling
I
that
mean-
it's optional. We
No, I guess
certainly want to
the
clarify
question is,
that it
I
isn't.
guess my question is more like for schools that are, I mean, it seems like a much easier thing for schools that are going to have had this capacity building to comply with it's not optional, right? So I'm just curious and trying to understand how, if we want to have more accountability around this, right? What would that require from a resources perspective? Because I think, we obviously think that it's beneficial to have schools be trained in these restorative approaches. We've invested resources in it, some. But then there are schools that aren't, as of right now, because it's a cohort approach, right? Like, going to be getting the benefit of that training. So, and as you say, I guess it's not optional. They have to come up with restorative approaches.
Well, they'll be
to
following
comply with the code of conduct,
Yeah.
but are there additional resources then that they would, given that there are schools that don't have the benefit of the training, are there additional resources or does maybe these schools don't need the training if it's just mandatory? I don't believe that, but
Sure.
I'm just trying to understand like how this actually connects back to, other decisions that we've made around how to invest resources in this.
Right. So I think to echo, the superintendent's yes, in terms of, doing an analysis of those resources.
Yes, Ms. Oliver?
Just maybe a quick technical question. On, I believe, page 17 is a student 16 to 18 years of age, and it goes on. And one of the changes was pupil who was at least, formerly it was 16, and now it says 17 years of age, and it talks about going into adult ed. You just clarify the purpose of that change?
It's statutory. It was a change made in 2016, effective in the summer of 2017, that has been implemented, is my understanding, per state statute, and now it just corrects that in the policy. If I may, there are a few other changes that came out of that same law, and you'll see they're quite technical. 5 days notice, that was on page 13, number C1 requires, it previously said that notice of an expulsion hearing had to be given within a reasonable period of time, and now it says 5 days, 5 business days. That's statutory now. Also on the next page, page 14, letter J was added to allow for the postponement of up to 1 week of an expulsion hearing if a parent or guardian indicates that they are accessing legal counsel for purposes of the expulsion hearing. That's statutory as well. The burden of proof language that was added under D3, it just clarifies the existing standards that we follow when we have administrative hearings. So again, these are just some clarifying aspects that page 17, as I already mentioned. The other technical change starts on page 21 and moves into page 22, and that eliminates reference to the Connecticut Juvenile Training School, which is no longer in operation. It was previously in the statute. The other kind of technical piece was an update to the legal reference section to delete public acts that were codified already and to add in those additional statutes that are now in existence.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Taylor?
Yes, Ms. Brody.
On page 1, can we, can it be explained, F, why public was put in that? Instead of not being able to be, it means exclusion from school privileges, and now we added public school privileges. Why?
I think that was done through the policy committee, but I'm pretty sure that the intent was to clarify. You're not sure?
No, I'm not sure. I'm like, I don't know why this was. I'm looking at you. You're like, you guys did that. Like, why are you
I didn't put it in,
Yeah.
but I can imagine that it was to clarify for purposes of, and please correct me if I'm inaccurate, but there are occasions where students are provided with alternative educational opportunities that might be at different facilities, and that might be what part of this was about. We don't expel students or exclude students from private facilities, which is the alternate to public, because we are a public school.
So maybe if it could be explained to me, because so we're saying if a student is expelled from, let me back up, is there state statute around expulsion and being excluded from certain buildings and?
The language of the statute says from school privileges.
Okay.
So when you are expelled, it is the process of excluding a student for more than 10 school days from school privileges, which is school accommodations, attending school, transportation purposes. However, there is an alternative educational opportunity that is provided, as we had talked about in the section that was just referenced.
Which would probably still be public, though, no? The alternative.
It would, but it is not the public school accommodations that is provided by state statute in terms of what's,
Can I get a little more specific?
Yeah, so I actually don't know why this word isn't here or when that change was made, but I can find out and get back to you all in terms of why. So by the next time this comes up, whether it be for a second read or if it goes back to committee, we'll have more information on why that's there, because I just don't know when it got there or.
From the staff, do we know if a child is expelled from a CREC school, are they not allowed on Hartford Public School grounds? Because that's what I was told. There's an activity that takes place that's not the school, not Hartford Public Schools activity, but the activity happens on school grounds, and they're expelled from a CREC school and they can't participate in this community activity because they're expelled from CREC. And it's at a Hartford school.
So I'm trying to think back if they are, there are students ultimately, even though they're enrolled in a CREC school. Don't we hear the expulsion?
That was going to be my question.
That we
because
hear the expulsion.
Different districts do a different process sometimes.
No, we hear it, the expulsion.
And often that is what happens, that the LEA hears the expulsion and that the expulsion is from school privileges, which would be school grounds.
Yeah. But they're expelled and they attend a school on school grounds on Hartford Public. You know what I'm saying? You're expelled from CREC, you go to New Visions, right? Which is a Hartford public school, but you can't participate with the organization that's renting a Hartford public school facility for an activity.
Do you have an example?
Yes.
Like you mean New Visions?
No, they were expelled from CREC.
They served the expulsion.
So they attend New Visions
during the duration.
Yes. So a community organization rents out our facility.
Oh, interesting.
They cannot participate because it's on Hartford Public Schools ground, but it has nothing to do with Hartford Public Schools. They're just renting the facility. So that's why I thought it was added to public. That was the reason for my question. But they attend school on Hartford Public School grounds. And I go, this is probably just weird because the student was expelled from CREC.
But the CBO is the function in which the student is participating is not during the school day?
No.
It is not.
They rent our organization rents our facility, and it's for neighborhood kids, whomever is a part of their organization. But the parent is saying they were told they cannot go on Hartford Public School grounds but you go to school on Hartford Public School grounds, so that's why I was a little bit confused.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure, and you're specific, it might be a very specific circumstance, but what generally happens, and I can speak very generally to what expulsion decisions look like, is that the expulsion is from school accommodations and school grounds. And that comes from the hearing officer's decision or the Board of Education's decision. I understand that you have a hearing officer who presides over your expulsions, and so I imagine it is something that is in the expulsion decision, and it is permissible to prohibit the student for the expulsion period, whatever that might be, from entering school grounds. So I imagine that it was written into the expulsion decision.
Okay, but you go to school on school grounds. That's what
with the exception of the alternative educational opportunity. And that's generally what it says. The student may participate in the alternative educational opportunity, but may not otherwise enter school grounds for the period of the expulsion.
So if there isn't anything additional, any pressing questions that individuals have, particularly around this. Oh, I actually have one. So on page 10, I just want to highlight this kind of like on record. It's something that we can talk about more either in committee or if it comes for a second read. The recording of the suspension in Power School. I have questions. I think that Power School is a fantastic tool, but I have questions around like who gets to access sort of like disciplinary records for students and like how we document them. And, none of us should be, what they say, judged by the worst thing you've ever done. So just having those sorts of things follow our students and having teachers or adults who are interacting with them fresh have access to old information around disciplinary challenges or anything else that may be in those sorts of files. So that's something that I just want to kind of put a pin in Is there
I can speak broadly to the issue if you want me to do that.
That'd be helpful.
There are a couple things around this issue. The broadest is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which specifically says that you may only look at student information if you have a legitimate educational interest in doing so, which means that any teacher couldn't just open up the proverbial file cabinet and look through any student's records. They have to have a legitimate educational interest in doing that. I understand that Power School, and I'm not a tech person, but I understand Power School has login requirements and entry requirements, and that you have to have passwords, and you only get access to certain information based on the protections that are put there. And I do like the fact that you put in Power School or whatever system we're using at the time, because we don't want to be certainly restricted by policy to using that. Another piece of that is that there are a variety of provisions in the student discipline statute that say how long we have to keep things in the file, and specifically discipline. For example, the retention, we can look to our retention schedules, how long do we have to keep things? Things like student detentions can be discarded after the period of a year, whereas suspensions and expulsions remain until a student graduates, and then they are expelled from the file and they will go away. There are other ways that students, through your policy as provided by statute, can kind of appeal, if it's their first offense, to have it taken out of their file, if they are first offenders, so to speak. So it goes back to the restorative justice piece of the code of conduct, and that there are ways for students to say, this was an error, I made a mistake, and here I want to appeal to the board, or I want to appeal to the administration, and have that kind of first offense pulled out.
Wonderful news. Good. Does anyone else have any additional comments on this particular policy, on policy 5131, conduct and discipline?
I wanted to make one more comment related to something that Ms. Browdy said, and that was because I don't believe it was addressed, when she asked about actual or perceived differentiating characteristics. So I think the spirit of number 6 is really protection for individuals who do have those differentiating characteristics. We certainly want to make it a teachable moment if there's a student who is, using wrong pronouns or not understanding gender fluidity. We certainly, and again, in our code of conduct, we have instructive responsive, we have corrective responses, and explicit guidance for school teams. But I want to mention in terms of actual or perceived. So you could have a student who does identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or you could have somebody who just constantly calls them gay every day, even though they're not. So I just want to say that's what is meant by, it could either be actual or it could be perceived. So that's where that language comes from.
Thank you for the clarification.
Sure.
And we'll continue to have that conversation because we want to make sure that our policies are also concise. I think that the gift and the curse of like having people who are really committed to students within our district is that sometimes we put in language just because we want to cover all circumstances. We want to be super fair, and we're like, don't forget to add undocumented people. Like we're adding all of these things in that other districts just don't have, or that is far outside of what state statute has recommended for us. So we want to make sure that our policies are something that really are able to highlight the most important and the most salient points, and that people are able to read and digest it. But I do appreciate the the inspirational approach to how we do policy in this district. So if there isn't anything additional on this particular policy, I would like to go to our formal informal vote. Ms. Brody, would you like?
I went first last time. I need more time to think.
You need more time? Okay, no problem. Okay, Ms. Glanville.
I'm sorry to give the policy committee more things, but I think that, I think there were a lot of issues raised here, and even the staff was talking about, maybe there needs to be some more tweaking, so in terms of how stuff was written, so I think it should go back to
Can you just pause
committee.
for 1 second?
Yeah.
So I just want to remind us that when it comes back up for a second read, we have another opportunity for this discussion. It can go back to committee for us to kind of start over, or if it needs to go to other committees within our board, but second read is also another opportunity, another kind of like bite at the apple. So keep that in mind as you're registering your informal, formal vote.
So to that, I know I asked this before, but there is going to be another policy, even if we go to second read. There's the second read, and there's also a policy committee meeting before that where we'll re-engage on all of this as well.
Exactly.
And so I guess this is more, I'm sorry to ask more questions, but I guess this is more of a question for the staff. Like, is there a process then whereby the staff would be, where we could say, okay, we don't have to send it back to committee, we're going to move to second read, but knowing that, but could it still be revised?
That's always the case. Whenever
Before the next committee meeting, though, isn't it next week? And then have the discussion there, and then have second read, or is that, I'm just trying to be mindful of, like, how much time people actually, how long this would actually take if we said, okay, we're just going to move to second read to actually do these kind of substantive revisions. I'm sorry to bog down in details, but
If the board recommends for it to go to second read, so from now until second read, there is time to revise the policy based on the conversation that has happened with the recommendation. So it can be approved with the amendments, the recommended amendments or changes that we've heard today. To Ms. Taylor's point, at the second read, if it's not satisfied to move forward for final approval, then it can go back to policy. But it doesn't have to go to policy this week. It goes to this. So the second read is in January. The board meeting in January.
okay, but if we say we want to send it back to committee, then it will go back to policy committee this week. Is that? Because I know we already have the
So
agenda.
it won't go back to policy committee for this week, but keep in mind that second read doesn't necessarily have to happen at the next consecutive board meeting, right?
Okay.
So we can put this if we feel as though we need more time to work with this in committee, we could say that this comes up for a second read, maybe at even a February. It would be outside of the cycle, but we're still kind of learning around getting this process down, and I'm very comfortable with saying that we could bring this back up for a second read in 2 months. Not necessarily in January. It doesn't have to be that in terms of process. Does that make good sense?
No, I just think I want to be clear about when we're being asked to say, do we want to send it to second read, or do we want to send it back
So
to
you want to know that
committee?
in
What is
advance,
that difference? I think that's all I'm trying to make sure
so-
we're all on the same page about what that distinction is. Because I don't know that I even fully understood it until maybe just now.
Right, and I think that we're kind of like working it out as we go, because ideally their policy would be reviewed in 2 buckets, like once in the winter and then again like kind of in the spring-ish, right? So that was what we were leaning towards in terms of having these workshops for first read and for dialogue around policies, particularly policies that need to have a lot of conversation. This won't necessarily have to be the case, I'm thinking, considering the backlog of policy for every single policy, right? We don't have to do this for every single one, but ones like the SGC policy, ones like school discipline or restraint and seclusion, or that, like, these are conversations that people want to have, and we want to engage folks around them. So for me, just for tonight, in terms of either sending it back to committee for us to have that discussion, it won't be this week. We'll talk about it, but probably not in the depth that we need to have the discussion. We could bring this back up for second read even outside of the cycle. So I could do that. If for February, I could do it for March board meeting if we wanted to do something specific for this, right? And then, I mean, since we moved the other one back to committee, then we probably won't have a bucket of policies in January, so we'll have to reconsider the schedule, right? It's a pilot.
Well, in lieu of that, I do think that we can move it for a second read, given that it seems like there's a lot of consensus around the things that the board wants to see clarified. And so, I mean, I'll let people speak for themselves, but in that there would be then time if it doesn't have to be the next meeting. And obviously a second bite of the apple at second read to say, nah, you didn't get it right. didn't really capture, what we were saying. So I'm comfortable with moving to a second read in some future date.
Okay, so we'll move it for a second read, and second read is also another opportunity to look at, to see if we've made these changes, to see if some of the language that we discussed is still here, and then at that point we can decide whether it needs to come back again. It doesn't necessarily have to be adopted at second read, even though ideally Policy Committee Chair would probably appreciate that it did move for adoption at the second reading, but it doesn't have to. So you're saying that you would send it for a second?
In light of what second read can be, yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Ms. Glanville. Mr. Flores?
Well, if what we're saying is that you can put changes in it even as it's moved to the second read, then I would go with the second read.
Thank you, Mr. Flores. Ms. Oliver?
Yes, I was going to say second read, because my own understanding, which may not be the correct one, is to send it back to policy committee means we're almost basically saying we're going to start over again versus taking in the feedback for today and moving it for the second read. The only other thing I would like to add is we do need to work on a legislative agenda. Many of the questions or concerns I had more to do with state statutes, I've learned, versus some of our own local policy. So if we could, someone write that down, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Definitely something that is on Policy Committee's mind, the legislative agenda and advocacy. So thank you for your vote. Ms. Brody, are you ready?
Second read.
Second read, thank you. So this policy, 5131 on conduct and discipline, has been vetted for first read and will come back again for a second read with the considerations and inquiries that people posed here this evening. Thank you so much. Okay. And our last agenda item is a discussion on the policies to repeal. And I will let Gwen from Shipman and Goodwin kind of take us through the policies that are slated to be repealed and kind of give us a quick overview as to why this is happening.
Sure, absolutely. I'm starting with the 4,000 series that are listed in your agenda, I believe. A majority of these policies are just statements of statute. For example, certification. All employees have to have the appropriate certification. It's all already in state law. The provision about evaluation, statutory requirements. They're very brief policy statements. I think they were included in the packet that was provided. They're very brief policy statements. They just reiterate what the law briefly says, and that's it. The goal in recommending repeal of a variety of all of these policies specifically is to kind of clean out the policy book, so to speak, and really include where we're required to have a policy by statute or by regulation, and to identify clear policies of the board as opposed to just replicating statute or just including what would be called a mission statement. Here's what we believe, as opposed to this is the policy of the Board of Education, and that's where most of these repeals come from. I just want to point out some specific ones that really do need to be repealed. On the personnel 4,000 section tenure status, currently as written, it permits the board to give tenure status to a teacher. Tenure status is provided by law, by statute. Once a teacher receives, has been serving for a certain period of time, that teacher gets tenure status. The board actually cannot grant it, and that's what the policy currently provides for. So that's something that we would need to be repealed, at least that portion of it. There's a bullying policy listed under personnel. That policy as currently written is, as I read it, a bit confusing because it talks about both students and staff, and is definitely a mission statement. You have a very clear safe school climate plan and bullying policy that deals with students and issues of bullying as required by statute and an extensive policy, and that is it's completely covered under here. So it's kind of replicating what's already in your student section there, and makes the issues confusing. Again, professional development, same issue. It's just a mission statement. We should provide professional development to our teachers. We do that. We do that in accordance with state statute. And evaluation supervision, same thing. 10-151 has a very clear rules about what our teacher evaluation plan has to have in it. And I'm sure we've spent a lot of time preparing our teacher evaluation plan and implementing that plan as well. So it's a very brief mission statement. That's the 4,000 series. Are there any questions about those? Again, they're very brief policies. I'll move on to the 5,000 series. The communicable infectious disease, again, it's covered by both state laws and federal laws and is actually quite more complicated than is written in this policy here. There are implications of Section 504 and the ADA and HIPAA in some circumstances. So what's written here is quite brief, and the existing laws cover all of those requirements and then go actually a step beyond what is written in this policy. Child abuse and neglect, I understand that's actually already been pulled from the website because there is a different policy that addresses it. So this was a duplication, and the policy 5156 actually was not updated for legislative changes. A significant number of legislative changes have happened over the past couple of years, as many of us know, relative to the reporting of child abuse and neglect. It is more appropriately in your personnel section than in your students section because it is mandatory obligations of your staff. Use of physical force, it is somewhat of an overlap with your restraint and seclusion policy, and it details, again, state statutes on use of physical force, very clear, and your restraint and seclusion policy covers a majority of what is in there, and it's also a very brief policy. Married and pregnant students is now, as of 2013, covered by state regulation. It used to be that students who were married, or students who were pregnant specifically, were considered special education students. That is no longer the law. That was changed in 2013, and there are very specific rules as to what the school can do, very broad, very individualized obligations of the school as to how to assist students who are pregnant. Are there any questions?
I have to ask a question. So the use of physical force. So we actually had a pretty lengthy policy committee discussion about the use of physical force, restraint and seclusion policy that we have that is, as you explained, encompass this. And it was discussed that this particular state statute is actually like a defense for, and that it was, I think at the time, it was actually confusing in training to our staff that this was in the affirmative policy, like because that policy is stating like what our affirmative duties are around this, and that it was very confusing to train because this was really not the affirmative standard that we would be training people to use physical force to protect property. But like if you were to use physical force against a student to protect property, like, and we had multiple examples of this, like a student is throwing computers, or a student is bashing computers, and somebody used physical force, then they would, that's nowhere affirmative in our policy that that's what we should do, but like they would have a defense against, I guess, an abuse. Yes, a criminal complaint, an abuse and neglect complaint against them too, I guess, right? Like
I don't know that that's
so
the case,
that's one of my questions.
It's a criminal statute.
Right, but so that is one of my questions. Is that a defense still against somebody who has been reported to have abused a student because they physically restrained them because they were destroying or something, they were protecting property, right? And then we had a lot of discussion, which I think it's good that this is being repealed, but I actually think that this language is still in our other policy. So maybe that's like a pin that we need to bring that policy back, because we had a lot of discussion around this that also, like, that's a blurry line because, in terms of it's a blurry line even in terms of a defense, right? But it's certainly not something we want to be training or having as the standard for our employees, because it's a blurry line, because it's like, okay, fine, maybe there's some rationale around, computers, I don't know. But, and this has happened, a student is throwing books on the ground. That's property. So can we use physical force? I mean, and so, I mean, but these are like real world, I know Karen's looking at me because this was such a long policy meeting that we had multiple meetings and I talked a lot. So I'm not going to talk that much now, but I think that this language is actually still in our policy. And we need to really address what this means or what we want this to mean from an affirmative, how we're training people standard, regardless of what like you're allowed to do, if you, how you're allowed to defend yourself if you end up doing something, but that's not what we want to be teaching and training people as to how we should be.
No.
So.
The reason it's in your physical restraint and seclusion policy, which is I believe what you're referencing, is because it's written into the physical restraint and seclusion law that it shall, and I'm not going to get the exact language right, but it is that notwithstanding this defense is how the language is written. And so meaning that often it is confused that this is a criminal defense statute.
Yes.
And so it is not an affirmative reason to use physical force on a student.
Right, but
It's
so
not, right,
in the
and
case where this happens, right? Because it happens in our district, where physical force is used on a student because of the student protecting property. That's the key difference in here from our affirmative standard, which is obviously if students hurting themselves, hurting someone else. You know, I think our affirmative training and standards of what the standard we were training people to covers that, but the difference certainly comes in property, that property language in here. And so, like, if a student, if somebody uses physical force on a student purely because they're trying to prevent the student from harming property, and someone should report of abuse and neglect be filed against that employee, you know, and then is this statute a defense to that? But is that a process that we still want to go through? I mean, we had lots of discussion around this, around the reporting of abuse and neglect policy and statute, or like the whole intent of the statute is to over-report, to report everything, not to try to. So, I mean, is this an instance where that dovetails back to our reporting of abuse and neglect statute, policy, and is this something, and then, you know, is it a defense to that, or is that a criminal, potentially a criminal situation, but it's not necessarily a criminal situation, this is a criminal statute. So I guess that's my question, like, does this apply as a defense if somebody has a report of abuse, a DCF called on them,
DCF
one of our
has
employees?
completely different standards. And this is statute, and it's in the criminal statute, so it's a defense if there were criminal charges brought. But that's the only way it applies. It's the only way it applies. So the restraint and seclusion policy specifically explains and now applies, we know, to regular ed students, special ed students, any student in our building, that there are only very specific reasons that a student may be restrained or secluded. If it's not a restraint or seclusion and there's physical force used, then the school needs to do an analysis as to whether it constitutes reasonable suspicion that abuse or neglect has occurred.
Okay.
Because that's that standard. And DCF has a different standard than the police.
And there's actually new revisions to the statute that was released to us in July. That so the restraint and seclusion is coming to the policy committee Thursday with the revisions. And I just had a meeting yesterday with Dr. Colon Rivas and Mr. Rios about also physical use when it comes to kind of employees, and some of the languages have changed that need to be looked at and revised, and that's coming very soon as well.
Okay.
Okay. The last section is policies included in section 6000. Again, all very similar reasons. They're very brief, more mission statements than policies. Just to highlight a few of them, the curriculum design and development is unnecessary. It instructs the assistant superintendent to make curriculum. Very basic, kind of either mission statements or it appears to be some kind of job descriptions that are covered elsewhere. And similar student government, it actually, trying to just look at my notes, it actually doesn't actually talk about student government, it talks about student involvement. So it's a very broad kind of mission statement. And the last one I just wanted to highlight was school readiness. The requirements are actually statutory. Policy isn't required. It's a very brief, again, policy statement. There was another one of smaller learning communities that the timeline for implementation of that policy, per the policy, has passed. So these are just things that we wanted to clean up, or the board wanted to, or the administration wanted to clean up. And that's it, unless there are other specific questions about the instruction policies. I'm sorry?
National Honor Society and school readiness, did you talk about that?
Yeah, they were similar reasons, that they're not necessary. If the board wanted to keep them, they should be updated and made to be less of a mission statement as to what we want to promote and more of a policy, as in, here's what we see this looking like in the school environment as implemented in the school environments. Because as written, they're all very brief, just kind of mission statements.
Any questions, commentary, or feedback on the proposed repeals for policy? And thank you so much for the explanation.
Just one. The organizations, associations, fraternities, sororities, and other secret societies.
6124.
6124, I'm sorry.
I didn't explain that one further.
Yeah, like, so when I think of it, I immediately think of the proud fraternities and sororities. When you grow up, you're going to be you know, like what it, so it, when it says they can't meet, is this covered somewhere else? I guess that's a better question.
Yeah, it's covered by the administration of your school activities. How are school activities administered? They are administered equally. So we don't require certain requirements, or how fraternities and sororities would work, that you have to pledge or be involved in some activities in order to be participant. The school administration permits school activities equally, on an equal basis. Any student is allowed to participate for equal reasons.
Okay,
and that's what this policy said.
Okay, because I was just thinking of some of our fraternities and sororities that want to give back, they want to tutor, they want to partner with schools, and they're going into the schools, not to say we want you to join, but really we showing you, what our organization is about. But in that way, so it's covered somewhere else.
Absolutely, and I think the goal is to promote inclusion and not exclusion, and that's how we administer. The administration administers all school activities, is inclusion. Correct. Correct.
Any additional questions or commentary around policy repeal? Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to take a bit of latitude here at this pilot. I think that the policies to be repealed, it's really important that we do it because of, we talked a lot about compliance and about accountability, and sometimes when you have a big old book of stuff that's outdated, people are less likely to adhere to the things that are up to date. You don't know what to pay attention to because there's just so much stuff. So it's definitely something that we need to do in order for us to be more effective. This is operational effectiveness, to be more specific and more on target. However, I do want for us to give this more of a look because we're repealing things and we're taking them out. And I think that this was a really great overview, but in terms of knowing what the replacement or stand-in or where else it's addressed is something that I'd like to hear more additional feedback on. So I would, if no one objects in this particular moment, and please do feel free to give feedback, I'd like to bring this to our January 10th Policy Committee meeting, these particular repeals for repeal on January 15th at our regular board meeting, if people are in agreement. So this would be considered the first read, and then do we adopt repeals? I'm not sure process-wise if that's how it works, but I would like for us to officially do that in January, but to give us a little bit more time when we're getting rid of things. I think that, because it's easy to get rid of things, but to bring it back if we needed it, like, I think that it requires a little bit more discussion, thought, and maybe people will leave here this evening and think of things like, oh, like maybe we actually do need this for married and pregnant students because the replacement or stand-in that's here is not sufficient per my perspective.
Question.
Yes.
Has there been a crosswalk done for these? So we have the identified place in which they might reside now.
Yes, so Julia Wilde, along with Christina and myself, after the policy recommended that we do a crosswalk, so that we actually using the sheet of all of the policies that are in that on that sheet, and actually do a crosswalk to what supersedes by statute, as long as also what we have in place that needs to be revision. In fact, I think one of the sheets that was emailed was actually kind of a snapshot of what we were using to do the crosswalk. So yes, to answer your question, yes, a crosswalk was done. And there was kind of a rationale to why that policy is being recommended for repeal, whether it's because a statute supersedes it, or it's somewhere else in our policy, or it's just outdated and no longer exists.
And so I've actually had these conversations with Julie, but in lieu of her absence this evening, and the fact that we haven't really had a thorough discussion about this at Policy Committee, I'd like to put this on our agenda for January 10th, and like kind of considering this to be our first read, and if people feel comfortable to be able to kind of bring it up in a more detailed way at the January 15th meeting to adopt the repeal. Okay. Wonderful. Any additional feedback, commentary on our inaugural Policy Committee workshop? Ms. Oliver?
No, I was just making a comment about the other. I would say, yeah, when we do repeals, I think it's important to do that at the regular board meeting, so that we are providing this opportunity again for public to be able to comment, et cetera. And I think the crosswalk is a really great reference, like maybe a tool that we could also have as part of the public documents, so that people could go, oh yeah, guess what, you could, it is this section. I know we kind of did it verbally tonight, but I think that would be helpful. So that was my 2 cents in that regards. So I found this to be a very helpful workshop. And again, thank you to my colleagues who are in policy. So you guys know I do more of the finance stuff. But this was really helpful to kind of talk this stuff through. I think that the public comment thing is a little interesting and probably has to be tweaked a bit. But all in all, I felt like this was a good use of time. Obviously, it's a lot of time, but I felt like it was a very good use of time. And you guys heard me, I feel strongly. This is one of our key responsibilities, so I think it's time well spent. So thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Anything additional? So I wanted to just really quickly thank Dr. Vasquez-Matos for bringing this idea. I've been on Policy Committee for a long time, kind of got like kicked out of the airplane with no chute in terms of being the chair. And so to be able to have a process for us to get these adopted is really comforting, particularly around policies that we want to be able to engage the public around. And some of the key takeaways from this evening, I'm thinking, is that maybe, Kim, to your point about what you were saying, the public comment piece, maybe we could have people submit questions, and then maybe that could be part of the discussion as opposed to having people actually sit here for, I'm thinking out loud right now. Also, I think that from this process, I've learned that it would be great to have a summary of the policy along with, understanding how we're situated as a district in comparison to the statutory requirement would be helpful. Also, the function of the policy within our district and the recent history of the document. And I think that having access to the regulations, which maybe people do on their laptops, would also be helpful. How are we putting this into practice? And also thinking through about like best practices throughout Connecticut, but definitely like among our neighbors and our peers, like districts that are like us and what our districts that aren't like us are doing. So, and also a racial equity policy. We should do that. That's exciting. So I really appreciate you all giving time to this evening, and for your comments and for your feedback, and for Dr. Vasquez-Matos' leadership on this, and to the superintendent as well. Thank you all so much for attending the inaugural Policy Committee workshop. Have a good evening.